Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the third screencast in Section 3.1, Chapter 3, Ecology. And we're going to talk about ecological methods. This is probably going to be a pretty short screencast. And we're just going to talk about how environmental scientists, ecologists, what they use to study out in the natural world, because it's not like you can do an experiment in a laboratory, and we're going to be doing many experiments, but it's not like you can really conduct an experiment in the lab effectively. But regardless of their tools, modern ecologists are going to use three methods in their work. The first one is observation. And we know that that's pretty consistent because you have to observe something, as we said before you can even ask a question about it. So one of my favorite scientists, female scientists, is Jane Goodall. And she was in Gambia, Africa, and she was studying the chimps. And the first thing that she did is she dressed herself up in very neutral colored clothing, and she went and sat on a peak, and she just observed. She looked at the whole area at this peak and observed the type of plants, observed the topography of the land, and she looked at that and she just watched. And that's the very first thing that we have to do is observe. The second method that the environmentalist is going to use or ecologist is going to use is experimentation. And it's a little bit harder to do experiments out in nature, but you can still experiment. So back to Jane Goodall, she wanted to see what would happen if she was able to lure the chimps into camp. So she put out bananas. And she observed what would happen with that interaction with the bananas, and they came and they ate the bananas, but then they started to fight the baboons who were competing for the bananas as well. So can you imagine? She had to come up with another way that allowed the chimps to come into the camp without having the baboons coming in. So experimentation. So from that, we're able to create models. And these models are going to be used to predict maybe climate, weather, predict behavior, predict what's going to be happening within that community or that particular ecosystem. And each of these approaches is going to go back to that heart of scientific methodology. And we're going to identify a problem, we're going to collect background information, we're going to form a hypothesis, develop an experiment, and so on to guide the inquiry for that. So we start off with observation, as I mentioned, and it's the first step in asking ecological questions. So we observe, we take a look, we see what the area is like, we observe the type of organisms that are there, and then from there, this is where our questions could develop from. And these questions may lead us to design that experiment and to make models. So experiments then are going to be used to test hypotheses. So with the chimps, if I put a banana in this special box and I allow the chimps to open the box, then they're going to be able to eat the bananas. That kind of thing. They're going to be able to come into camp. So you can design your experiment and this can test the hypothesis. So an ecologist may set up an artificial environment in a laboratory or a greenhouse and then carefully alter the conditions in selected parts of natural ecosystems. In Arizona, there is a desert, the Sonoran Desert, and there is a building there called Biosphere 2, I believe it's called. And it was set up in order for a group of scientists to be able to live within the self-contained system. And they thought they had all the right plants, and they had water, and they had everything in there that they thought they would need to survive for a 2-year period of time. It was a flop. It was one giant flop. They didn't raise enough food. They were starving at times. Oxygen was poor, so they had to pump oxygen in. But now today, that biosphere is used for experimenting. And there's trees that they have in one area, and we can trap and alter the amount of carbon dioxide with the trees to see how they're going to react to increasing levels of carbon dioxide, like what's happening within our world. And we can see how they store that carbon dioxide and what happens with the excess. So that's a way an experiment can be performed. There's also within this biosphere a saltwater ecosystem, and this ecosystem got overrun with algae, and it didn't allow the corals to grow. So now they've learned about the algae eating fish that need to be in there, the amount of light, and they know how to control the algae so that the corals can grow. So they can experiment on it, and they do. They experiment what happens to the corals when the algae overgrows. And then they see what happens to the corals where the fish can eat the algae, and they can control this experiment. Okay, so they can select the conditions and alter the conditions as needed. And then from this they can make a model. And these models, as I said, can be in the form of a graph. They can be in the form of a chart. You know, there's so many different forms that models can come in, but they can then use those models to predict what can happen if they alter the marine ecosystem environment or they put too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So ecologists make these models to help them understand the phenomena that they happen to be studying. All right, that is the end of this section. I told you it would be shorter, and we'll start section 3.2 in the next screencast. See you in a little bit.